I was rinsing the dinner dishes when my daughter-in-law grabbed the plate right out of my hands and slammed it into the sink so hard it cracked in two. "Who washes dishes like that?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the kitchen like a whip. "You leave grease on everything. It's disgusting." My son, sitting 10 feet away at the kitchen table with his laptop, didn't look up. He just reached over and turned up the volume on his earbuds. He heard her. I know he heard her. And he chose his playlist over his mother. My name is Marian. I am 68 years old. And until 14 months ago, I believed that family was the one thing in this world you could count on when everything else fell apart. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. My husband passed in February, 2 years before all of this happened. Gerald had been sick for a while. His heart, the doctor said, had been working too hard for too long. He died on a Tuesday morning while I was in the kitchen making his oatmeal with the brown sugar he wasn't supposed to have, but always begged for. By the time I carried the bowl down the hall, he was gone. Just like that. 51 years of marriage, and it ended while I was stirring oatmeal. The grief is something I won't try to explain here. There aren't words that fit it. What I will say is that our house in Dayton, the Colonial on Birchwood Drive with the wraparound porch and the oak tree Gerald planted the year our son was born, suddenly felt like it was made of nothing but silence and his absence. Every room held something of him. His reading chair, his coffee mug still in the cabinet, his handwriting on the grocery list I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Our son Kyle called me every few days at first, then once a week. Then one Sunday evening he called and said, "Mum, we've been talking and we think you should come live with us. You shouldn't be rattling around that big house alone. It's not safe at your age." His wife, Sherry, had apparently agreed to it. That surprised me, but I was in no state to question a life raft when one was offered. I made a decision I will regret for the rest of my life. I sold the house on Birchwood Drive. I want to be clear about this, because it's the part people will ask about. I sold it because Kyle and Sherry said I should. Kyle said there was no point in paying property taxes and maintenance on a house I wasn't living in. He said it would be simpler. He said, and I remember this exactly because I've replayed it 1,000 times, "Just bring what matters to you, Mom. We have plenty of room." The house sold for $340,000. Kyle suggested I put the money into a joint account that he could help me manage, since Gerald had handled our finances and I was, in his words, not really used to dealing with that stuff. I agreed. I was 66 years old, I had just buried my husband, and my son was offering to help. I agreed. I moved into their house in Columbus in April, 6 weeks after Gerald's funeral. Kyle and Sherry had a 4-bedroom colonial, newer than mine, with granite countertops and a television in every room. Their daughter, Madison, was 8 and shy around me at first. Their spare bedroom was at the end of the hall, small, with a window that looked out onto the side of the neighbor's fence. Sherry greeted me at the door with a hug that lasted exactly the right amount of time to be polite, and not 1 second more. "Welcome, Marian," she said. Not Mom, not even a warm smile behind the words. Just Marian, stated like a fact. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I told myself I would settle in and things would get easier. I was wrong about that too. The first week, I tried to be useful. I got up at 6 every morning, made coffee, started breakfast. Kyle ate quickly and left for work. Sherry came down later and studied my cooking the way a health inspector studies a restaurant that's already failed once. The eggs were too done. The toast was the wrong bread. I'd used the wrong pan for the bacon and left a ring on the stovetop. I smiled and nodded and tried again the next morning. I cleaned the kitchen after every meal. I did laundry. I picked up Madison from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays when Sherry had her real estate calls. I folded towels and changed the guest bathroom hand soap when it ran out and swept the back porch without being asked. I became the thing I had spent my whole adult life being: useful, quiet, accommodating, invisible. But there's something about invisible that people don't tell you. Once you become it, they stop seeing you entirely. And then they stop treating you like a person. By June, Sherry had stopped bothering to lower her voice when she criticized me. The coffee was too weak. I'd vacuumed the wrong day and disturbed her video call. I'd let Madison watch a cartoon Sherry didn't approve of. Small things. Every day, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who has decided you have no real standing to push back. Kyle was there for most of it. He heard most of it. He never said a word. I lay awake at night and asked myself what I had done wrong as a mother. I thought about all the years I'd packed his lunches and driven him to baseball practice and sat up past midnight sewing a costume for the school play he'd forgotten to tell me about until the night before. I thought about the college tuition, the car I'd co-signed for when he was 22, the Thanksgiving I'd driven 4 hours in a snowstorm because he'd asked me to. I thought about all of that, and I looked at the ceiling in that small room at the end of the hall, and I could not make the math add up. Then came the night of the dishes. I had cooked dinner, pot roast, which Kyle had loved since he was a boy. Sherry had eaten 2 bites and spent most of the meal on her phone. Afterward, I was cleaning up, rinsing the plates before loading them into the dishwasher the way Gerald and I had always done it. Sherry walked into the kitchen, took one look at the plate in my hand, and grabbed it away from me. That's when she slammed it into the sink. That's when she said what she said about the grease. That's when Kyle turned up his earbuds. I stood very still for a moment. My hands were wet. The broken plate was in 2 pieces in the sink. Sherry had already walked out of the kitchen, and something inside me, some last quiet part that had been holding on, simply let go. I don't entirely remember deciding to do what I did next. I remember it more as something that happened through me than something I chose. I picked up the other plates, one by one, and I set them on the counter, not slammed. I wasn't angry in a throwing way. I was done in a much quieter way. I stacked them deliberately, then I walked to the cabinet and took out every dish I had touched in the past 3 months, every pan, every bowl, every serving dish, and I set them all on the counter in a row. Then I took my apron off the hook by the stove, folded it once, laid it on top of the stack, and walked out of the kitchen. Kyle appeared in the hallway. "Mum? What are you doing? What is all that?" "I'm done cooking in that kitchen," I said. My voice was steady. I surprised myself. "She's having some kind of episode," Sherry called from the living room. "I'm not having an episode," I said, still very calm. "Your wife broke a plate and screamed at me for washing dishes. Your earbuds were in. You chose not to hear it. I am 68 years old and I cooked that man pot roast tonight. I am done." Kyle looked at me the way people look at a situation they don't want to deal with. Then he said, "Mom, maybe you should get some rest. You've been emotional since Dad passed." That was the moment I knew, not just that my marriage had failed, but that something fundamental in my son had changed. Or maybe had always been this way, and Gerald and I had simply never looked closely enough. 3 days later, Kyle knocked on my bedroom door. His voice was careful. "Sherry and I have been talking. We think this arrangement isn't really working. We think it might be better if you found your own place. There are some really nice senior apartments in the area. We'd help you look." I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. "And the money?" I asked. "The money from my house?" There was a pause that told me everything before he said a word. "We've had some expenses, Mom. The roof needed replacing. Madison's tuition for private school. Sherry's business had a slow quarter. We used some of it, but we can pay you back, just not all at once." I didn't ask how much was left. I could tell from his face it wasn't enough to matter. He gave me 2 weeks. He booked me into an extended stay motel off Route 40 and handed me $400 in cash. He hugged me at the door, a real hug, like he meant it, which almost made it worse, and said he'd call me soon. He didn't call. The motel was the kind of place that had once been something better. The carpet was the color of a bad decision. The heater made a clicking sound all night. I was paying $65 a night, which meant my $400 would last 6 days. I lay on that bed the first night and did the math over and over, as if a different answer might appear. It didn't. I called Kyle on day 3. Voicemail. Day 4. Voicemail. I sent a text. RID. No reply. On day 6, I checked out of the motel with my 2 suitcases and a carry-on bag, and no plan. I sat in a McDonald's for 3 hours, nursing a coffee because it was warm, and no one asked me to leave. An older man at the next table, homeless, I understood from the way he arranged his belongings, caught my eye at one point and gave me a nod that I felt in my chest. He knew something about sitting somewhere just to have somewhere to sit. I was learning it too. I slept in the lobby of a 24-hour Walgreens the first night. I told the overnight clerk I was waiting for my ride. She was maybe 22 and didn't ask again. By 2 in the morning, I wasn't performing waiting anymore. I was just sitting in a plastic chair with my suitcases around me, and she had the good grace to look the other way. The days after that blur together at the edges. There was a church on 5th Street that did hot meals on Mondays and Fridays. I went every time. There was a public library that opened at 9 and closed at 6. And the librarian, a woman about my age with reading glasses on a beaded chain, never once made me feel like I didn't belong there. I read books I hadn't made time for in years. I read in the warmth, and I tried to remember who I had been before I became someone's wife, and then someone's mother, and then, apparently, someone's problem. I had a small rolling suitcase I kept with me everywhere. Inside, underneath 2 folded blouses and Gerald's old cardigan that I couldn't bring myself to leave behind. I had kept a manila envelope I pulled from the bottom of my cedar chest before I left Birchwood Drive. Gerald had put it there himself, years ago, and told me it was important papers. I hadn't opened it since he passed. I'd meant to, I knew I should, but grief makes you put things off. And then Kyle was offering help, and I had told myself there was time. There is never as much time as you think. One afternoon in the library while rain came down hard outside and I had nothing else to do, I finally opened it. There was a letter in Gerald's handwriting. I recognized his blocky, left-leaning print immediately, and seeing it almost undid me right there at the library table. "My Marian," it started. "If you're reading this, then I didn't get the chance to explain things to you the way I always meant to. I kept meaning to sit you down and go through everything, and I kept putting it off because I wanted to protect you from the worry of it. That was my mistake, and I'm sorry. Gerald had been careful with money, our entire marriage. Not just careful, methodical. He'd grown up with nothing, the son of a coal miner from eastern Kentucky, and that early scarcity had shaped everything about how he moved through the world. He'd worked 40 years in industrial supply, had taken every extra shift, had bought stock in his company back in 1987, when no one in his department thought it was worth anything. He bought a small commercial property in Cincinnati in 1994, a strip of 3 storefronts on Montgomery Road, because a man he trusted told him the neighborhood was about to turn, and Gerald had believed him, and the man had been right. The letter went on for 2 pages, front and back. By the time I reached the end, my hands were trembling so badly, I had to set it down and press them flat on the table. There were documents tucked behind the letter: the deed to the Montgomery Road property, brokerage account statements, a life insurance policy I had not known existed, $200,000 with me as the sole beneficiary, and at the very bottom, a business card for a woman named Patricia Wells, an estate attorney in Dayton, with Gerald's handwriting across the back. "She knows everything. Call her." I sat in that library chair for a long time. I had been sleeping in a Walgreens lobby and eating church soup and watching my day shrink around me, and I owned a commercial property in Cincinnati and a brokerage account with Gerald's 40 years of careful saving sitting in it. The insurance money alone would have kept me housed for years, and my son had known, or should have known, that Gerald had assets. He'd handled some of the estate paperwork after Gerald passed. He would have seen references to Patricia Wells. He had steered me toward a joint account and the quick sale, and away from anything that looked too closely at what Gerald had actually left me. I thought about that for a very long time. Then I called Patricia Wells. She answered on the second ring. When I told her my name, there was a beat of silence, and then she said, "Mrs. Marian, we have been trying to reach you for over a year. Where are you?" When I told her I was in a public library in Columbus with 2 suitcases, she said, "Don't move. I'm sending someone." The car that came was a plain black sedan, driven by a paralegal named James, who was polite and did not ask questions I didn't want to answer. He drove me to a Hampton Inn near the highway where Patricia Wells had already booked a room under the firm's account. When I got to the room and saw a real bed and the bathroom with towels that smelled like something clean, I sat on the edge of the mattress and cried in a way I had not let myself cry since Gerald's funeral. Patricia Wells met with me the next morning. She was a small, precise woman in her 60s, with silver hair cut close, and the manner of someone who had spent decades dealing with the worst things families do to one another, and had decided that efficiency was the most honest form of compassion. She explained my situation with the directness I needed. Gerald's estate, properly administered, was worth approximately $1.2 million. The brokerage accounts, the life insurance, and the Cincinnati property which had been appraised the previous year at $680,000. Fully leased to 3 commercial tenants who had been paying rent to an account Gerald had set up specifically for that purpose, and which Kyle had apparently never located or disclosed. Your son, Patricia said, choosing her words carefully, did not act as executor in a way that fully served your interests. She gave me time to absorb that. The $340,000 from the sale of your Dayton home, she continued, was your personal asset, separate from the estate. Do you have documentation of the account it went into? I gave her what I had. She made copies. We have options, she said. I asked her what she meant. She told me. I spent 3 days in that hotel room ordering room service and reading every document Patricia gave me and sleeping 10 hours a night like someone paying off a very old debt. On the 4th day, I called Patricia and told her what I had decided. The Cincinnati property had a management company handling its day-to-day operations, but the leases came up for renewal on a rolling basis, and I, as the owner, had final say on all terms. One of the commercial tenants, a mid-size accounting firm on the corner unit, also happened to employ Sherry's brother as a senior accountant. Patricia confirmed this during her background review. I didn't ask her to look into it. She volunteered the information as relevant context. I was not interested in targeting Sherry's brother. He had nothing to do with what had been done to me. But I was interested in understanding what I owned and what I controlled. And the answer, it turned out, was more than anyone had let me believe. Patricia filed the appropriate legal notices. The joint account Kyle had opened with my money, the one he'd used to pay for a new roof, private school, and a slow quarter in Sherry's real estate business, became the subject of a civil claim. There is a word for taking someone's money by convincing them to trust you with it and then spending it on yourself. The legal process for addressing that was underway. I did not call Kyle to warn him. I had called him 17 times from that motel. He had not called him back once. I found an apartment, a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building in a quiet part of Columbus, while everything was being sorted out. Patricia arranged an advance from the estate so I could pay the deposit and first month's rent. I brought only what fit in my suitcases plus Gerald's cardigan and his photographs and a kitchen plant I'd carried from Birchwood Drive that had somehow survived everything. I bought new dishes, plain white ones, nothing fancy. I chose them myself. I enrolled in a beginner watercolor class at the community center 4 blocks away. I was the oldest person there by about 20 years, and the woman who taught it, a woman named Ruth who smelled like turpentine and peppermint, told me on the first day that watercolor rewards patience and forgives mistakes better than most mediums. I thought that was probably true of a lot of things. I also started going to the women's shelter on Grant Avenue, not as a resident but as a volunteer. I'd read about it in a leaflet at the library and gone on a Tuesday just to ask if they needed help. They put me in the kitchen. I cooked soup, real soup, the kind that takes a few hours, and I served it to women who were in the place I had recently been, and I didn't tell any of them my story because it wasn't what they needed. What they needed was to eat something warm and have someone hand them a bowl and look at them like they mattered. I could do that. The legal process took several months. I won't explain all of it because parts of it still make me angry and parts of it still make me sad. And I'm trying to hold those two feelings at a careful distance from each other. What I will say is this: Kyle was required to return the money that could be documented. Not all of it. Some of it was genuinely gone, spent, absorbed into a life he could no longer afford to maintain. The legal settlement was less than what I had lost and more than nothing, which is often what justice actually looks like up close. Kyle and Sherry separated in the spring. I did not know about this until Kyle called me, not voicemail, not text, on a Thursday evening in April. I answered. I don't entirely know why. Maybe because I had spent enough time being someone who didn't answer when she should have, and I didn't want to become the version of that in return. He sounded like a man who had lost a great deal of weight very quickly. Not physically, though that too, from what I could tell. I mean that he sounded stripped down, smaller, like the version of Kyle that remained after you removed the house and the income and the life he'd been performing. Mom, he said, and then nothing else for a moment. I'm here, I said. I know you didn't have to pick up. I know that too. He told me what had happened. The separation, the fact that he was renting a studio apartment near his office, that Sherry had filed first, that he had seen the legal documents Patricia had filed and had understood, finally, completely, what he had allowed to happen to me. I told myself it wasn't that bad, he said. I told myself you'd be fine. I told myself you were just adjusting, and that we needed space, and that I was doing the responsible thing managing your money. I told myself a lot of things, Mum, and I believed them because it was easier. I let him talk. When you called from the motel, he said, I saw it and I didn't call back. I saw every single one. I was in the kitchen with Sherry and she said if I called you back, it would just make things harder. And I put the phone face down. I put it face down and I went back to making dinner. He was crying. I could hear it. I know, I said. I don't have any right to ask you for anything. No, I agreed. You don't? There was a long silence. Outside my window, someone was walking a dog. The evening light was doing something nice through the curtains. Gerald's photograph was on the bookshelf across the room, and in it he was laughing at something I had said, and his face was so familiar it still surprised me sometimes, finding it there. Can I ask you something anyway? Kyle said. I waited. Did you love Dad and me enough that there's anything left after everything? Is there anything left, Mum? I thought about the women at the shelter eating soup. I thought about the library and the rain and the man in McDonald's who had nodded at me like a fellow traveller. I thought about Gerald's letter and how he had written, I always knew you were stronger than you realised, and how angry I had been reading that, because why had he never said it out loud? There's something left, I said finally. I don't know what shape it's in yet, and I need you to understand that I don't trust you. I want to be honest with you about that. Not to punish you, just because it's true, and I'm done pretending things are other than they are. Okay, he said quietly. That's fair. If you're serious about changing, get a therapist. Do the work. Don't do it for me. Do it because you have a daughter who is watching you. He said he already had an appointment. I believed him, partly because I wanted to, and partly because his voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it in years, something that sounded like it might be real. We didn't talk for another 2 months after that. Then he called on Gerald's birthday, just to say he remembered. Then at Thanksgiving, to ask if I was okay. Small calls, nothing that demanded anything from me. I didn't close the door. I didn't open it either. I just left it at whatever it was, which was more than nothing and less than before, and I decided that was acceptable for now. Patricia closed out the last of the estate matters in November. I sat in her office while she walked me through the final accounting, and when she was done, she took off her glasses and looked at me and said, You held up very well, Marian. I thought about that on the drive home. I thought about all the ways holding up is both necessary and insufficient. I had held up because I had no choice, and then I had kept holding up after I had a choice, because it turned out that was just who I was. I had not known that about myself before. Gerald had apparently known. He'd said so in the letter, and that blocky, left-leaning handwriting, You are tougher than you've ever had to be. I hope you never need to find that out, but if you do, I believe in you. I had found it out. I would have preferred not to. My apartment is small and entirely mine. There was a couch I chose, a kitchen I cook in for myself, a window box I planted in March with herbs that are doing better than expected. On Friday evenings, I take my watercolor supplies to the park and paint badly and without apology. My instructor, Ruth, says I'm improving, which I think is kind of her and possibly true. I still volunteer at the shelter on Tuesdays. Last week, a woman came in with 2 kids and a garbage bag of belongings, and that specific look people get when they've held themselves together through something terrible and are not sure they can hold any longer. I poured her a cup of coffee and sat across from her at the table and didn't say anything wise or encouraging. I just said, You made it here, that's real. She nodded and wrapped both hands around the cup and didn't speak for a while, and that was fine. Some things don't need more than that. I wrote in my journal that night, the leather one I bought last fall and had been filling slowly, one evening at a time. I wrote, I spent most of my life learning to take up as little space as possible. I am learning, late, that I was wrong about the wisdom of that. Space is not something you earn by making yourself smaller. It is something you claim by deciding you exist. Gerald would have said something about that. He would have said it better, probably. He had a gift for finding the simple true thing and saying it plainly, but he left me with enough to find it myself. He always did. I keep thinking about the moment I finally opened that envelope. Not because of the money, though the money changed everything, practically speaking, but because of what it meant that I had been carrying it with me the whole time and hadn't looked inside. I had the answer in my suitcase for weeks, while I sat in a Walgreens lobby at 2 in the morning pretending to wait for a ride. That says something about what years of shrinking yourself does to a person. You stop believing there's anything in your own hands worth opening. What happened to me didn't happen because I was weak. I want to be clear about that, because I spent a long time believing it did. It happened because I trusted the wrong people with decisions I should have kept for myself, and I trusted them because I had spent 51 years with a man I loved and that love had worked, and I made the mistake of assuming that the people who came from that love were equally trustworthy. Kyle wasn't a monster. He was a man who had learned that I would accommodate, and he kept asking me to accommodate until the accommodation became everything. That's how it works, I think. It's rarely one dramatic moment. It's 100 small moments where you let something slide, where you tell yourself it isn't worth the argument, where you fold the apron and smile and try again tomorrow, and eventually you folded yourself so completely that you don't take up any space at all, and the people around you stop remembering that you need any. Gerald knew something about me that I hadn't known about myself. He'd written it in that letter, that I was tougher than I'd ever had to be. He was right, and I thought about why he never said it out loud when he was alive. I think he believed he was protecting me. I think a lot of the people who love us believe that keeping us comfortable is the same as preparing us. It isn't. There's a kind of wisdom that only comes from being forced to navigate something difficult without anyone else steering, and I had never had the chance to develop it until everything fell apart. I'm not grateful for what Kyle and Sherry did. I want to be honest about that too. I don't think suffering is a gift. I think what happened to me was wrong, and the fact that I found my footing afterward doesn't make the doing of it acceptable. But I did find my footing. I found it because when I had nothing left to lose, I stopped accommodating and started deciding. I called Patricia. I opened the envelope. I signed the papers. I chose the apartment and the dishes and the watercolor class. Every one of those was a choice I made for myself, maybe for the first time in a very long time. The character we end up with isn't the one we're born with or even the one we raise. It's the one we build under pressure when the comfortable version of ourselves has nowhere left to hide. I know now that I have a spine. I know I can read a legal document and ask hard questions and sit across from a son who hurt me and tell him the truth without flinching. I didn't know any of that before. I had to lose almost everything to find out what I was actually made of. If you're someone who has been making yourself smaller to keep the peace, in your home, in your family, in any room you walk into, I want you to hear this from someone who understands the cost of it. The peace you're keeping isn't peace. It's just postponed honesty. And you are not doing anyone any favors, least of all yourself, by disappearing into the walls. You have more in your suitcase than you think. Open the envelope.